hello. I couldn't think of whether to say good evening or something like that, but I'll just say hello. I'm Chuck Lane. I'm a columnist and editorial writer for The Post, and I'll be taking you through the last half hour or so of today's events. Together with our two panelists, I'm tempted to say they need no introduction, but I'll give them one anyway. To my left, not ideologically, but just in terms of where she's sitting, is Ann Coulter, conservative commentator, author, and I think it's fair to say provocateur, or let's put it this way, someone who makes her living off free speech. And to even farther to the left, again, not necessarily ideologically, is Nadine Strossen, who I would say has made her living defending free speech. She's formerly the president of the American Civil Liberties Union and was the first female to hold that position, and remains a professor of law at the New York Law School at a small town to the north of here. So welcome to both of these pretty interesting guests, and I think we'll just jump right in. Our subject is, I think, the issues raised by free speech that's provocative, free speech that's offensive, speech that's right up at the edge of what we do protect or might protect or maybe shouldn't protect. And I thought I would ask, starting with you, Ann, I mean, something I've often wondered observing your career is, do you think civility is a good thing? No, I'm quite serious. Do you?
I think those are fighting words right there.
Yeah, do you think there's an independent value in the kind of in muting one's opinions from time to time, in deference to what other people might consider standards or sensitivities or so forth? That's not to say that you would necessarily trim or control the substance. But I'm very curious, because obviously you're someone who's forever being criticized for lacking civility. What's your answer to that question?
I think that's mostly said by people who don't read me and don't listen to me. I don't think I do ever breach any civility terms. And what I've seen in the last week on television about, how we have to calm our rhetoric, or it will set off a Bernie Sanders supporter. I mean, this nonsense about how Lion Ted or Crooked Hillary, it's fighting words. No, I would say if you're really looking at something that's going to set people off, calling Trump and Trump supporters and conservatives akin to Hitler, Nazis, racists, white supremacists, that's not only uncivil, it's quite dehumanizing. All of the things that I get accused of saying, A, I didn't say it all, or B, it was part of a joke and come on, give me a break. It is not uncivil. So yeah, I mean, I don't think my career shows much incivility, but I'll step out and say for some people, I mean, Milo, not Milo, by the way, you mispronounced his name, is very funny, and he's making serious points. He's a lot more outrageous than I am. But a lot of the headlines that Breitbart was attacked for example, they were almost all Milo opinions, or rather articles, almost all of them. And okay, it was an outrageous title, but then you read the article and he was making serious points. And what, are we supposed to, we have to write like David Hackett Souter to be civil? We can't write like Scalia?
Nadine, you were actually good friends with the late Justice Scalia. I'm not sure you would put him quite in the same category with Milo Yiannopoulos.
Can I say something about civility?
I want you to say something about civility. Can I just ask it to you this way? You, as I said before, you've done a lot of defending of people who are thought to be uncivil. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there were times when the folks you were defending, or the ACLU was defending, really you kind of had a little qualm about it. And so, based on that experience, how do you think about the question?
Well, I actually, I hesitate to say never, but so far, and I challenge somebody to break the record, have never had a qualm about defending an expression, an opinion, verbiage, because To me, it is never the particular speaker that's at issue. It's never the particular word or idea that's at issue. I always am aware of the underlying principle, because I know actual cases where for every person who says X, I am in effect defending the right of somebody else in another part of the country to say not X. Now, in terms of civility, I have to laugh because when I was elected ACLU president, the pull quote on my biography in the New York Times was, "I want to emphasize the American and American Civil Liberties Union." This was a time when we were accused of being unpatriotic for defending people accused of terrorism and all kinds of other nasty things. And my husband, who had attended many ACLU meetings where we are shouting and haranguing and harassing, looked at that and he said, "I wish you would defend the civil and American Civil Liberties Union."
Well, you know, you guys are, both of you, I think, in luck, because just yesterday the Supreme Court, in the course of defending the right of Asian American rock band to use a common slur of Asian Americans as its own name of its own band as a trademark, issued some pretty strong language in favor of free speech generally. And I'll just give you a brief quote. "The proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom to express the thought that we hate." That was the opinion by Justice Alito, and then Justice Kennedy sort of added, "A law that can be directed against speech found offensive to some portion of the public can be turned against minority and dissenting views to the detriment of all." And Nadine, I want to ask you, I mean, those are very common arguments offered for the sort of utility of free speech. Is that really true?
It is actually really true.
Or are we in kind of a race to the bottom? As some people say?
I think each one of us is offended by something that we disagree with, as has been said throughout the day. So by definition, anybody who is challenging the status quo, anybody who is protesting things as they are, anybody who is advocating law reform, social justice reform throughout history has been accused of offensive speech and dangerous speech. You know, go back and look at the abolitionists who were censored, go back and look at the civil rights demonstrators who were censored. Why did Martin Luther King write his famous letter from a Birmingham jail? And you look at the laws that were raised against him and other civil rights protesters, they were accused of offending the community values. They were accused of endangering the welfare of the Republic, things as they are. That was certainly true for the suffragist movement, for the women's rights movement, the reproductive freedom movement. Margaret Sanger spent a lot of time in prison. Obviously true for the LGBT rights movement. They're advocating their sexuality, even coming out of the closet and self-identifying was seen as offensive. So as Justice John Marshall Harlan, I'm honored to have a chaired professorship named after him, and he was a great First Amendment justice, a conservative Republican, by the way. He said, one man's vulgarity is another man's lyric. And I would say one person's offensive speech is somebody else's challenging the status quo, rocking the boat speech.
So Anne, picking up on that, do you feel extra validated in the sense that Nadine just suggested when people react the way they do sometimes to the things you say? Does that give you the sense like, wow, I must really be on the right track?
No, I think the college campuses have gone insane, and it is so far outside the realm of normal discourse. I mean, when you have Bill Maher, Elizabeth Warren, the ACLU, I assume, Barack Obama reaching out to denounce Berkeley for shutting down my speech. I mean, my shocking, challenging the status quo speech was essentially going to be the laws on the books on immigration, we should enforce them. And that is apparently worthy of riots. I do think we have a big problem. I mean, the law is quite good. I would also say about this Slants decision, and this is the Republican position on not just free speech, but civil rights law. I do think African Americans are in a special category. Rehnquist always said that. I think once you say you can't say the N-word, and I don't think white people should say the N-word. I'm talking about civility now, not the law. I think that is a special, separate category. You have the history of slavery, of Jim Crow. That's its own category. But do not start saying to me, illegal alien is the same as the N-word, slant is the same as the N-word. No, nothing is the same as the N-word, and I just think it confuses the issue when we start pretending everything is the N-word. That is how people shut down speech, and I think, as to go back to your first question, as a matter of civility, not as a matter of law.
And there are also two different types of expression that you're talking about, Anne. One is a face-to-face insult or insulting people by using a derogatory term. The other is an idea that people dislike, and that's a whole different kettle of fish, right? And one of the things that really disturbs me is how the H word, hate, which is being overused and abused, we were hearing the term hate speech and even hate crime for policy positions that people dislike.
Well, sometimes it's more than a mere
No,
policy.
but very often, seriously, people who take certain positions on immigration, who take certain positions on gay marriage, who take certain positions on abortion, even on voting. And I just wrote a book about this, and there was actually a professor somewhere in California, not Berkeley, who actually said that voting for Trump was a hate crime. And she took pains to say, I meant that literally. And there are many examples like that. And what scares me is that it's not just rhetoric, right? There are consequences, because if something is a crime, and somebody else said the whole election was terrorism. Well, we punish terrorists, we outlaw them. And I think that is the analogy that's being made, is that there are certain ideas that are considered tantamount to violence, and therefore, just as we outlaw and punish violence, we have to outlaw and punish those ideas, or take vigilante justice
or shoot
into our own hands.
Well, so, Anne, have you ever gone too far? I mean that seriously. Have you ever thought back, and you don't have to say specifically, but have you ever thought back on something you said or written?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, all of the things that, I mean, look at the things that get lifted up, and you said, I've run through them. And for a long time, there was a list going around, and finally, John Cloud wrote the Time magazine cover story on me, and he went through them all, and I said, yeah, I didn't say that, I didn't say that. And he ordered all the original tapes from TV to see that I didn't say any of that. They were all lies. Since then, it's been jokes that, as if they've, were translated into German by a computer, then retranslated through Swedish, and finally it comes out as English. It bears no resemblance. If you look at what I actually said, oh, come on, give me a break, I'm making a point, and often making a point with a joke, but since those are the ones that have been raised to me, I can't think of any that I wouldn't have said. I'll defend any of them that you can remember right now and tell you what the real thing was I said.
And humor is a big part of this, and satire. And so when you talk about offense and civility, one thing that really does go by the wayside, if we're so careful with our words, is humor and satire. We have a lot of people who are taking everything extremely literally. I mean,
well, let me ask you, I mean, in that
I was
vein,
going to give an example, and then I self-censored. So,
well, and I'm so glad you did, because if you felt like censoring it, it must have really been bad.
Everybody's titillated now.
Just today, and on this humor thing, just today, you tweeted, Anne, it may have been yesterday, apropos of this case in Fairfax County, Virginia, where a young Muslim woman was killed, and the police are investigating this case of road rage, and apparently this person of interest in the case may have been here illegally, and your tweet was, when dreamers kill Muslims, what do the media say about that, or something like that?
Does the media report it?
Does the media report it? Now, of course, we don't know that he's necessarily a dreamer, though he might be here illegal. And my question to you is, how much of that is a joke? How much of that is satire? How much of that is deliberate provocation? Or in your view, how much of it is just like a statement of fact? Because it isn't really established that he's a dreamer yet. And so my question to you is that something you've said that we should take kind of as a joke?
No, I would say that's dead on serious. I'd like to know how the Washington Post is reporting that. I would like to know if that's going to get big coverage, because I promise you, if it was a white male Trump voter, oh, everybody in this audience would have heard about it. They'd move the Russia investigation aside for it. But it's an illegal 17-year-old from El Salvador.
So
that was a serious question. Now, I will admit, and I've let this practice go when I tweet out my Dreamer of the Week, like the one who raped the woman in the Hamptons last week. Dreamer of the Week is a joke.
And I guess my question is, Anne, part of the problem I think your audience has is maybe you should put like a little asterisk or something on things that say this one is a joke.
Why?
Because
it makes the point and makes the point. I don't care if it gives you a little smile or not.
Because the reason I ask that is because after the fact, you can always say it was just
I
a
don't,
joke.
though. I mean, unless it's a really obvious joke. I mean, a lot of these were taken from CPAC, and, you know, people can dispute humor, but when I have 7,000 people in the room and they all start laughing, that's funny, Chuck. Those are funny. Other than that, Dreamer of the Week, I don't care if you get a little smile. I want it to advertise a story that I'm pretty sure the Washington Post isn't covering.
Now, Nadine, I want to ask you from your perspective as a civil libertarian. As the quotes I read from the Supreme Court decision suggest, there's a certain there's a way in which we, I think, kind of have grown accustomed to justifying a very strong pro-free speech position in utilitarian terms. It works, it improves debate, and so on. Suppose that weren't true. Suppose it didn't improve debate. Would you still be for it? Is this an end in itself?
I couldn't say it better than Justice Brandeis at the beginning of or early in the 20th century, and I'm only going to paraphrase him, but he basically said that we revere freedom of speech both as an end in and of itself and for its instrumental value. And I agree with both of those points. In terms of its inherent value, it's inherently important to each of us as an individual to be able to express ourselves. That's an inherent aspect of autonomy. Justice Kennedy said that freedom of speech is the beginning of freedom of thought, and that's got to be the beginning of individual liberty and autonomy and self-definition. It's also inherently important in a democratic republic such as we have. How can we, the people, exercise our power as the governors and hold accountable to us those we elect to represent and serve us unless we have complete robust freedom of speech? And that includes being able to say hateful and spiteful and ornery things about politicians. And I don't think that we need to have an asterisk saying, oh, this is said with a wink or this is said seriously. There is also an instrumental value, and I fully agree with Justice Douglas, who said for many other justices, in defending the right of a fascist who was being attacked by Antifa, which we're seeing again, including in Berkeley, and he was extremely to the left himself. So these were people who were completely against his own political ideology. But he said free speech may best serve its high purpose when it is outrageous and when it arouses people to anger, because that may motivate them. It may galvanize them to either change the status quo, to argue against those they disagree with. But it's part of being an individual, and it's part of being a member of a democratic republic.
Well, you know, Anne, I want to ask you the following. There are some democratic countries where that last sentence of Nadine's is not held to be true.
Most.
So a very good example with which I'm passingly familiar is Germany, where they have very strict rules banning the display of Nazi symbols. They have rules that put under surveillance organizations that are thought to be anti-democratic in nature, and so on and so on. And those rules, I think, were actually installed somewhat with the encouragement of the United States government after World War II, in part, not in part, entirely because their interpretation of their history was that when you allowed utter freedom to the worst kinds of demagogues, you'll get a disaster. So do you think Germany is right to have those laws, Anne?
It's not just Germany, it's most of Western Europe, including England, that fought Hitler, which seems kind of crazy to me. I mean, for America, I'm glad we have a First Amendment. It's even crazier than that. There was a guy in England who was recently charged not for public drunkenness. He came out, a college student came out of a bar, saw a cop on a horse and said, "Excuse me, sir, do you know your horse is gay?" And he was charged with committing a hate crime for saying that.
I asked you about Germany, and I have a reason for that. So I want.
Well, okay, but England has the same laws most of Western Europe does. We don't, and I'm glad we don't. But if I were in one of those countries that does not have a First Amendment, I'm wondering how long are we will we ever get over reliving the glories of the Second World War? How about applying that to Muslim extremist speech today when you have in Paris and London these attacks by extremist Muslims? I mean, if they have no problem with saying you can't deny the Holocaust, I'm really not worried about there being another Holocaust.
Well,
I am worried about another terrorist attack that we seem to be getting every 3 weeks. But weirdly, they don't want to apply that.
Well, at least in Germany, as far as I understand recent history, they have applied the Holocaust denial and other rules to certain preachers and certain
No, I want that's not it. I want social media where they're praising ISIS might be a little
so-called
tip-off.
extremist and anti-terrorist speech is also severely punished in those countries as well. And I want to answer the question about Germany and Holocaust. There's some free speech you don't protect. We'll get to that.
No, I'm saying in countries, if you're going to say you can't deny the Holocaust, how about you can't fly the ISIS
flag? You can't have a double standard. And I agree. Once you start to make exceptions about certain messages are verboten, to use the German example, then you're going down a slippery slope, because you and I and everybody in the audience is going to have the speech that we consider to be the most dangerous. But there is so much misunderstanding about what went on in the Weimar Republic leading up to Nazism. I have to tell you, I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. The man who headed the ACLU during the infamous or famous Skokie case, whichever way you look at it, which is kind of epitomizes the American viewpoint that we will defend to the death your right to say even ideas that are antithetical. Certainly Nazi speech was antithetical to the ACLU. Aryeh Neyer, who was the executive director of the ACLU at the time, was himself a Holocaust survivor. His entire family, except for his immediate family, was wiped out. And he has said that if I believed, I hate the Nazis more than I love free speech, more than I hate censorship. If I believed that censoring Nazi hate speech would have defeated Nazism, I would be all in favor of it. And he then goes through an instrumental strategic analysis. I mean, as somebody else made the point earlier today, Weimar Germany, when Hitler rose to power, had hate speech laws and enforced them. The leading Jewish organizations of the day said the laws were enforced fairly. Leading Nazis and public publishers of racist anti-Semitic publications were repeatedly, dozens of times, prosecuted and put in prison. And guess what? That became a big platform for them to propagate their ideas. Now, the big difference there and what happened in this country is that actual racist anti-Semitic political violence was not punished. So the Nazis could get away with murder, literally. They beat up and assaulted and killed Jews and other minorities and their opponents. And the analogy would have been as if in this country we didn't prosecute those who were committing murder and violence against civil rights demonstrators. So there is, to me, an absolute distinction between outlawing and punishing violent conduct, including the kind of violent conduct we saw in Berkeley, quite frankly, because it's to the same effect, stopping people from speaking freely and debating freely.
Well, I should have known I would get an extremely erudite answer from you on that, but I want to press the point in a slightly different way, which is, I think in our time, we speak about the First Amendment and its values and the very expansive view of it that's reflected in the recent Supreme Court doctrine that we're all familiar with. We kind of take that for granted without really reflecting on how historically relatively new that is. That is to say that within the relatively recent past in this country, there was a lot of censorship. There was a lot of official repression of speech. And on the other side, there was a lot of official racism and official oppression of minority groups that was absolutely written into the law, and the victims of that were not protected. And in other words, our history is not as sort of clean on either side of this ledger as we often like to think. And I think that's a good question for you, because I think an assumption you you have, it seems to me, listening to you, is that this has always been the American way, right? That this very, very expansive, anything goes kind of view of free speech. And doesn't it give you some pause to reflect on how in the past, actually, the view you're upholding probably wasn't actually upheld as in pure form as it once was?
No, in fact, I probably would not be as much of an extreme free speech supporter as the ACLU in some ways. In some ways, I might be more of a free speech supporter.
I'd like to hear those.
I'm moderating this panel.
Sorry.
But I would
think
too.
you guys supported the abortion clinic protest
Yes,
ban.
oh, usually we do.
Ann wins.
No, but that's to say there's
But
debate
anyway.
and free speech within an organization.
Okay, answer the question. We only have 4 minutes.
I think there are others. I mean, there are a few ways I would do things differently. There's one thing, the obvious one. Any conservative will say I am against incorporating all of the amendments except the ones that do not place limits on Congress, but oh well, that ship has sailed. But I would like to have 50 little experiments to see, for example, what things can be, what limits you can have, and while still maintaining civility. But oh well, I lost the incorporation debate. The other place where I think I would be less free speech protecting than the ACLU and a lot of free speech purists is, and I forget who this is. I used to be a lawyer, but I haven't been for a long time, and I haven't read a Supreme Court case in a long time. I think it was Bork, you will correct me, but I do think it's true that there are different types of free speech. There is core free speech, and as you get farther and farther away from the core, you may have less protection. And the place where I would have the least protection are things that aren't speech. They're expressive acts, like a parade, like the Nazis marching in Skokie. I mean, if it's a rule that's going to be applied generally, there I would be a lot more open to restrictions when there's a good argument on the other side than when it is someone speaking, than when it is someone writing, and particularly when it is someone speaking and writing on public policy issues. I think that is at the core, and there ought to be, or we ought to consider more restrictions the more we get to, a pile of poop being modern art.
Well, what's so interesting is that the civil rights movement really flourished because, for many reasons, but a key component was Supreme Court decisions that upheld not only equal rights, but freedom of speech. And it's very striking. If you look at the classic landmark free speech opinions, including those which upheld the right to burn flags and demonstrate and kneel in and sit in and pray, and of course the famous New York Times versus Sullivan libel case, all of these cases arose from the civil rights movement. And why was that true? It was because their messages were the ones that were being censored because they were seen as offensive and dangerous and violent. And before that, in the McCarthy era, the Cold War era, because communism was so feared and hated, that's when we got these terrible free speech decisions upholding the government's power to censor. It happened during the Red Scare as well. And in fact, Harry Calvin, a great professor at the University of Chicago, accusing the justices maybe of being a little bit result-oriented, said the blacks won back for us the free speech rights that the Reds lost for us. That the court was so sympathetic to civil rights movement and recognized that the lifeblood of any protest movement, including that one, was freedom of speech. So the two became mutually reinforcing as they advanced to far beyond where they had been earlier in our
Nadine,
history.
I'm going to put this to you, and well, I'm just going to go for it. I totally get that the same First Amendment protects Anne and Milo and anybody else you want to name.
Martin Luther King.
And Martin Luther King, the same first. But do we want to say, do we want to conclude from that there's a moral equivalence between Anne and Martin Luther King? Or is it just the issue that we're talking about of the constitutional rights that they both
And this came up in an earlier panel. I believe very strongly that those of us who defend a broad view of freedom of speech have a moral responsibility to condemn, criticize, denounce, refute ideas that we disagree with, even though we are defending your right to express them. And in fact, the ACLU had a policy going back to its founding when we were defending extremists and other anti-civil libertarian speakers. In the very same policy, it said, and you have a responsibility to go out there and counter-demonstrate against them after you've defended their right to demonstrate. And I think what's so interesting about American society is even though we don't have the hate speech laws, which are censoring so much mainstream political speech or anything that is not liked by the power elite, that goes against the prevailing orthodoxy, very scary examples. In fact, in the United States, there is, and you may not like this, but as a factual matter, civil society is censuring speech, not censoring it, but condemning it, denouncing it, exercising so much social pressure that a lot doesn't get said, or if it gets said, it gets denounced. And that, you may feel that there's too much of a chilling effect, but I think we should not kid ourselves that just because the government isn't suppressing speech, that you can get away with saying anything here.
All right, so we're almost out of time, but I want to ask my final question to you, Ann, which is something like this. It seems like a lot of what really bothers you, and a lot of what gives a lot of energy to the things you say out on the trail, is the perceived double standard that you feel like things you say get condemned when the equivalent is not condemned by, all right-thinking people. So if the people who are against you, so to speak, were smart, how would they be responding to you? What would be the most effective way for them to counter what you're doing?
Well, I'm not sure I
go ahead and give it away.
Tell an audience of Washington Post people the most effective way to counter him. Well,
because Nadine's assumption is more speech.
Yep.
Right?
And that trying to shut you down is just going to amplify your audience.
Right. Let's assume they're not going to shut you down.
No, I got to tell you, I think you guys are doing the exact right thing by totally ignoring me and pretending I don't exist and trying to prevent me from giving college speeches. I think that's the right approach. And one final thing, I don't think you're the moral equivalent of Martin Luther King either.
Well, I knew that going in. Well, thank you.
I don't know why that was set up, but
thank you both very much for a pretty good panel. And thank you to the audience for sitting politely and indulging us with great civility.
For sitting civilly.
Yes. And again, I guess that's the end for today, Marty?
That's all, folks?
Oh, there's a little more to come. They were going to come with a giant cane like, Night at the Apollo or whatever and take
no
us.
audience questions?
So should we get up?
Yeah, there was nothing on Twitter.
Okay.
I can't believe it. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.